1 is to gather your pattern pieces. Make sure you've got all of the pattern pieces cut out to the size that you're going to be making. So if you're doing medium, you need all the medium sizes. Step 2 is to decide on your fabric choices. Place the pattern piece for the main fabric panel in a corner. Pin or weight down your pattern piece on the fabric and then cut around it. Cut the base and the drawstring channel out of a contrast fabric. Cut out your lining fabric in the lining fabric which has been provided. Now we're ready to start putting the bag together once it's all cut out. First step is to take your main pieces and then your base pieces. Lay both main pieces face up. Now lay the base panel face down on top of one of the main exterior panels. Use a few pins to keep the pieces together along that long line. Because the pattern's American, the seam allowances are in inches, so the seam allowance is 1/2 inch. If this is your first time sewing, you might want to mark the seam allowance on the fabric first before you start sewing. Take the 2 pieces over to the sewing machine. Your stitch length needs to be about 2.4 or 2.5. So on my machine, it's the number on the right. So it's the one with the straight stitch. The other one's how wide it is, which doesn't really matter right now. The seam allowance for this is 1/2 inch. So you need to find on the sewing machine the mark that shows you 1/2 inch and line up that long edge on the 1/2 inch mark. Make sure your long edge is against the 1/2 inch mark, and you're going to put the presser foot down. This bit here, the bit that goes up and down, that's the presser foot. And on the side of the machine, there'll be something a bit like this, which lowers the presser foot. So just move that down and the presser foot should land on your fabric. Remove the first pin because you don't want to sew over it. If you sew over it, it might go in your eyes. It might break and go in your eyes. You really don't want to do that. Okay, now we're going to start sewing. So you want to put your right foot on the machine's foot pedal and you're going to press down really gently. You're going to hold onto the fabric at the same time and you're going to guide the needle along the line that you've drawn. As soon as you're off the end, take your foot off the pedal. In this case, we need to turn the handle on the side of the machine, on the right hand side of the machine. So the needle comes up and then you can move your fabric to one side, pull, 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 and then use your scissors to cut the thread. Trim your thread right next to your fabric. Repeat with the other piece. Both of your pieces out so that both right sides are facing up. We're not going to be using ironing boards, so you might want to finger press it down a little bit. Now we're going to do a tricky bit. We're going to take it over to the machine and we're going to try and top stitch. So we're going to be stitching along the base piece as close to this join as we can, trying to keep it straight. It's the first time, so if it goes a little bit awry, it doesn't really matter. Just try and keep it on the base piece and go nice and slow. At this stage, the seam of the main panel needs to be facing down. Now you're going to top stitch. One way to do this is to line up the edge of the piece that you're stitching along the very edge of the machine foot and then press the presser foot down. Then we're going to move the position of the needle so that it is as close to the edge of the join as possible. We're going to move the needle across by, on this machine, pressing the first plus, as many times as we can. Now you're going to top stitch. In order to do that, you need to keep the seam nice and flat. So hold it as flat as you can, and then keeping your fingers out of the way of the needle, you're going to sew all the way down as close as you can to the edge, nice and slowly. And repeat with the other one. The next step is to put the two exterior panel pieces together. So you're going to place one upside down on top of the other and match all the edges. Pins down the two side pieces, because that's the bit you're going to sew next. And you're going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance again. So you might want to measure that out and draw the line just like you did before. And then pin along the bottom. You're going to sew all the way down the two sides and then all the way along the bottom. You need to change your stitch length back to the 2.4 or 2.5, away from wherever you put it to sew your top stitching. Now we have to get ready to create the base of the bag. So we basically have to cut a little angle of 45 degrees off this piece here and this piece here. So make it easy for you, you might want to draw it on first. Then cut those bits off. The next bit sounds quite tricky, but it's actually quite easy. You have to put your hand inside the bag and then pull the hole that you've got so it's flat across just the bottom. And then you're going to pin that together, trying to match the two seams in the middle, pin it together. Probably you need to decide also which direction your seams are going to go in and make sure they go in the same direction and pin them down. The seam that you've got going across the bottom, you need to make sure it's all going in the same direction. So decide which way you want it to go, down probably, and then pin it. You're now going to sew across here using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So on this side and on the other side, a 1/2 inch seam allowance, just like you did before. Make sure when you sew that the seams are going in the same direction on both sides. So this way and that way. The next stage is to sew the lining together. So place the two lining pieces right sides together and you can mark your seam allowances. So 1/2 inch in, down each side and along the bottom. So you're going to do about 2 inches there and 2 inches there, but you're going to leave this in the middle. So that's about 4 inches. You're going to leave that unsewn so that you're going to turn the bag right side out eventually, but don't worry about that now, just leave that unsewn. You're going to cut off the corners around this square section, just like you did with the outer piece. Sew that seam 1/2 inch in, just like you did before, on both sides. Now take your drawstring pieces. You're going to mark 1/4 inch in on both of the short sides. Then you're going to turn the piece that you've measured to the wrong side and then you're going to fold it over again. You can't see it, but I've added another row of stitching, 3 centimeters this time, from the raw edge. That when I put that on the bag, that should make the top of the bag ruffle a little bit. Lay your bag flat on the table with the right side up, so just so the side seams are at the side, because we're going to join the ruffle top to the bag. You've pinned one of the top bits to the bag around the edge. Turn the bag over, lay it flat so that you've got the side seams at the side and it's nice and flat, and then you're going to pin the other edge along the side, along the top, exactly the same way. You'll see when I've pinned it, I've just folded the bag so that the side seam's in the middle at the moment. You can see when I've put the two top bits on, there's a tiny gap at the side seam. It's the same on the other side. That's okay, because the cord's going to go through there and it will draw it together. So what you need to do now is to sew all the way around the top at 1/2 inch seam allowance. When you get to these bits where there's a gap, just keep sewing. You don't need to stop there, you just keep doing it in a continuous line. Now I'm going to place the lining inside the bag. So you need the lining piece wrong sides out, so your seam's facing out and your bag the right side facing out, and you're going to place the bag inside the lining piece. So I've got my bag inside my lining piece. Now the two right sides are together and I've matched up the side seams first. So the side seam of the bag is now in the same place as the side seam as the lining piece, and you're going to pin it together at the top, but you're going to leave the drawstring part that you've just sewn on the proper bag, you're going to leave that folded down. So you're going to pin around the top of all of this bit, and the drawstring part is actually facing down there inside against the lining. all the way around the top at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once you've sewn all the way through, you're going to pull the bag through the hole that you left in the bottom of the lining. I'm not going to be able to film that because I need 2 hands to do it, but you need to put your fingers through there and pull the bag through this hole. Just be gentle, but you as long as you've sewn it properly, it won't do it any harm. It looks like halfway through, it's a big scrundled, scrunchy mess, but keep going. What it looks like when I've got both of the two separated. So what you can see now is that the drawstring channel is now nice and loose on the top, and you've got the lining here, and we need to do something about this hole in the bottom now. So you're basically just going to fold the seam allowances inside, so you've got a nice fold like that where you had the hole, and you're going to sew all the way across, a little bit further than where the opening was. You're going to sew all the way across, making sure you backstitch at both ends, all the way across at 1/2 inch seam allowance. That's what it looks like when you've done it. It looks a bit weird because you've used the same colour thread as for the main bag. It doesn't matter because it's for the lining and it's going to be pushed inside. Nobody's going to be seeing it. Now you push the whole of the lining inside the bag. Now we're going to top stitch around this seam. That will keep the lining inside the bag and it will keep that nice and neat. So what you need to do is when you take it over to the sewing machine, place the edge of your sewing foot, the presser foot, against this edge on the main bit of the bag, and you're going to sew about 1/8 of an inch, so about 1/2 centimetre all the way around the bag. I've got the presser foot against the edge of the main bit of the bag, not on the drawstring channel. I've actually moved my needle across so that the needle is about 1/2 centimetre away from the edge, and I'm just sewing all the way around this edge. Here's what that looks like when I've finished all the way around, and that's where I backstitched to make it nice. I've tried to make sure as I'm sewing that I'm going to meet up when I get to the end of the circle that I'm sewing. I'm going to meet up so it's not at different levels. Now we're going to put our drawstring cords in. So I've just estimated how much drawstring cord I wanted. So what I did was just lay it across the bag and see how much I might want dangling across the edge. Of course, when you actually draw the bag together, those dangly end bits are going to be much longer. So we'll put it in and decide how much we want to cut off at the end. Now I've put the cord through the channel in the drawstring channel bit by attaching a sort of medium-sized safety pin, because the bit that you're threading it through is quite small. So you're looking for the gap in the bottom. You're starting to thread it through there. So you attach the safety pin to one end and you start poking it through. Don't poke so far that this bit disappears through this end. So you need both tails of the cord hanging out the end when you're done, and then you just take the safety pin off this end and you do the same thing with the cord on the other end. When you've got both cords in, make sure, even them out so that they're the same length both sides, and then what you're going to do is tie a knot in the end. So you're going to tie a knot in this end and a knot in this end. Two cords knotted together, you can then decide how much of this you want to chop off, but don't chop off too much because it's going to fray anyway. So you want to chop a little bit off probably because it looks a bit odd, and then you are finished.